Welcome to Fun and Fundraising, everybody, the podcast where we talk with people behind top nonprofit galas and signature fundraising events to showcase how they positively transform their communities. I am your host, Rob Giardinelli, and today I'm really excited to have my good friend Lydia Fenet on as a guest. Lydia is the CEO of the Lydia Fenet Agency. And over the last 25 years, she's had a really interesting background. I don't want to give too much away, but over the last 25 years, she has raised over $1 billion as an auctioneer. So I thought it would be fun to kind of go through the tales and the travails and all those fun things about, what it takes to raise $1 billion in auctions over the years. And I know we'll have a lot of fun with it. And, we'll dive into some really good things throughout the episode. And Lydia, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to have you on as a guest today.
Oh, Rob, it's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me to be on.
Absolutely. So, I'd love for you to talk about your path to becoming an auctioneer and how that journey started for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I started working at Christie's Auction House as an intern when I was in college. And I think I told you this story when we were seated next to each other at the Austin Contemporary dinner. But I read an article in Vanity Fair magazine when I was in college about the auction world. And I did not grow up in the auction world. I didn't grow up in the art world. I knew about museums, but I didn't realize there was a business behind auctions. And I became completely obsessed with working there after reading this article. It was about Princess Diana's dresses being sold at Christie's. And it just seemed really glamorous and magical, which I guess at that point in my life were the only two things that I thought that a job needed to be. So my requirements were very minimal in terms of the jobs that I wanted to have when I was 19. And I applied for the internship. It was already full. I called the internship coordinator every day for 2 weeks until she finally let me come in. I was supposed to have a modified internship because it was already full, but I ended up doing everything that everyone else did. And frankly, I never left after that. I came right back after I graduated from college, was hired into the events department. And when you're in the events department, all of the requests for auctioneers come into the events department. And so a lot of times as a junior member of the events team, you will go out with the auctioneers to big charity galas around New York City and help staff them. So you're the spotter in the back calling out the paddle numbers, or you're the big clerk on stage next to the auctioneer. And so I had this really interesting vantage point because a lot of the auctioneers who were charity auctioneers were also art auctioneers. And those are two very different styles of auctioneering. Art auctioneering is formulaic, it's very mathematical. You're walking into a room where people are seated, they know they're coming to an auction, they come with a price in mind. Charity auctions are a little bit like the Wild West. It's like you're on stage. Nobody knows that you're on there. Nobody half the time even knows what they're bidding on unless the organization has done a good job, which I assure you in most cases is not the case. And so, especially when I first started taking it, it wasn't what it is today. And it was very much, my mother knitted a beautiful scarf and we're going to put it in the live auction and good luck to the auctioneer. So the art auctioneers would often say to me before they got on stage, completely nervous, really worried about what was going to happen. God, I hate doing this. I wish I didn't have to do this. And I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, this looks like so much fun. And about 4 years after I got to Christie's, at that time, all of the auctioneers had to be officers in the company, which meant that you probably had worked at the company for 10 plus years. And 9 times out of 10, well, actually 10 times out of 10, you were a guy because auctioneers were typically men. And so that was usually who tried out. And that was usually who were officers. That was also who were officers in the company. And there was a year where a lot of our auctioneers missed auctions and they let the entire company try out. If you wanted to go down to the sale room that day and throw your hat in the ring, anyone could do it. And I decided to go. And it's a little bit like Survivor, trying out to be an auctioneer. You get cut over multiple days. So first day, half the class is cut. The second day, the half of that class is cut. Third day, the same thing happens. And on the fourth day, I was still there. And there were 3 guys with me. 2 were much older. One was sort of a little bit older than me. And they didn't really say anything except, listen, we don't really know what to do with you because we don't really know who would want an auctioneer A, your age, and B, a woman, but there's something about you on stage. So we'll just send you to the auctions that nobody else wants to take. And I like to say, when you're 24 living in New York City and you don't really know a lot of people and you're an extrovert, I mean, that's all you need to hear. I would take anything that anybody sent my way. And within the first couple of years, it was 50 auctions a year, then 70 auctions a year, then 100 auctions a year. And this was always on top of my full-time job. So, I'd be finishing up an event, changing into a cocktail dress, and then running out of the back door to be on the stage somewhere in New York City. So that's how it started. And, it seems very glamorous when I talk about my job now, and it seems very glamorous even to me, but those early days were so brutal. There's nothing quite as brutal as being a charity auctioneer when things are not going well and the audience is not on board and everyone's talking over you. But it gives you a lot of life lessons, I'll tell you that.
I love you sharing that. Now, do you remember either your first auction or one of your very, very early auctions and something that you kind of learned kind of immediately that this is a key to success of being an auctioneer?
Well, I remember my first auction, and that was definitely not an auction where I would ever have thought that that was the key to being a successful auctioneer. I took my gavel, I slammed it down. I was in Kansas City in the middle of the winter because I was taking the auctions that nobody wants to take. And it was an art auction, which I didn't really know much about the art that was on the walls. And I remember I slammed the gavel down, the handle of my gavel broke off, and the top rolled under the podium. And by the time I stood up, nobody was paying attention. And that was the entire auction start to finish. And I was so deflated and so upset. I remember crying. I mean, it was awful. And I had a lot of those, honestly, for many, many years. It wasn't an easy thing to learn how to do. The audiences typically don't want to pay attention. And even if you are good at it, it still is 50-50 most of the time as to whether or not it's going to go well. And then about probably 8 or 9 years into my auctioneering career, maybe a little bit less than that, but it had been a lot. Let's call it 500 or 600 auctions. I had a night where I was really sick and I still had to go because, as I said, I was taking the auctions that nobody wanted to take. So nobody was going to take the auctions that I was taking, even if I couldn't, even if I didn't feel like it. And I got on stage and I felt so bad that I couldn't even pretend to be the sort of old British gentleman that had become my personality on stage. I was emulating the art auctioneers. So I would use words like shall and could and this very sort of affected accent to which nobody responded. And that night, I just felt so awful that I started kind of joking with the audience, like I would joke with a friend. And the first lot was a lot at the home of one of our top clients. But what no one in the audience knew was that she'd been seated next to me when I was running the events department years before, when the guy I thought I was going to marry broke up with me, like at 11 o'clock the night before that lunch. So I had to go to work and I sat next to her and she's like, so how are you doing? And I just started sobbing because I was, a heartbroken 25, 26-year-old. And I cried and I cried and I cried. And she could not have been nicer, Rob. When I tell you, I mean, she was feeding me wine. She was drying my tears with napkins and the tablecloth at one point because I'm a crier. And she just was so sweet. And so I said to the audience something along the lines of, ladies and gentlemen, there is no doubt in my mind that if you go to Jennifer's house, you're going to have an amazing cocktail experience and a fabulous dinner. But what you should know is that if you're currently having a hard time, I sat next to Jennifer over the course of one lunch. She nursed me back to health after a horrible breakup. So what I would say to you is save your money on anything else, spend it here because Jennifer is the therapist you never knew that you needed. And the audience kind of started chuckling. And I was like kind of watching people's faces. And then I lent into the second one. It was something about like a funny experience in Mexico. And I was talking about senior frogs and Girls Gone Wild and how lucky I was that I never signed that waiver. And this man literally turned his chair around to watch me. And I was like, oh, wait, this is actually the secret. It's that I have to entertain the crowd. I can't stand up here and be an art auctioneer because I'm not selling art. I'm selling a pony at 11 o'clock at night that nobody wants. And unless they've had enough tequila, is definitely not going to buy. So how do I make it fun for the people who aren't going to buy it, but I need them to stop talking? And I realized that it was humor. And so, I say to people all the time, I mean, if you see me on stage now, it's almost like an improv has crept into my auctioneering. And some people will say to me, like, so you're a stand-up comedian who does auctioneering? And I'm like, no, I'm an auctioneer, but I use humor as a way to make people pay attention.
That's fantastic. But I would add one thing. And, you had mentioned, that, we met, a while back, being seated next to each other. And that's kind of when people are always like, why do you show up at things? It's to meet people like you, Lydia. So, I mean, it's if you're very lucky, you get seated next to somebody and it's like you've known each other for 20 years and you just chat. But I think the thing that I realized when I was seated next to you and when you were talking about kind of that night where you kind of shifted, you were really being yourself
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
you are a naturally funny person, you're a naturally outgoing person, you're a naturally really warm person. And when you're all three of those things, it's I don't want to say it's easy to entertain the crowd, but that is part of your natural persona. And that's the one thing I interpreted just listening to you now is, you were just being yourself. And that's really kind of, it sounds like when you're, you know, when you just, like with your podcast name, Claim Your Confidence in your book, that's really where your confidence really, it sounds like just in you describing that really just started to take off.
Yeah, I said in The Most Powerful Woman in the Room Is You, which was my first book, I wrote a chapter called Sell as Yourself, because I do think so much about life is about putting yourself forward in a way that feels authentic. And what I had learned in that first decade was I'm not a 70-year-old British man. And I think what I'd come up against so many times is when I walked in the room, people would say that to me. It was like, where's the auctioneer when I would walk in? And I would say, I'm the auctioneer. And they'd say, no, 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 not the spotter or the bid clerk, the auctioneer. And, at first I would want to die because it makes you feel terrible when somebody challenges you. And then you internalize it because you're concerned that they're right. Maybe I'm not an auctioneer. Meanwhile, I was the person on stage taking the auction. So therefore I was an auctioneer, but it's almost that feeling of imposter syndrome. I'm not really supposed to be here. You guys can see it. And I'm smiling, but you're saying these words that are making me feel like what I already feel is real. And when I was able to show up as that person on stage that night, what I realized was there's something inherently funny about the fact that I'm doing a job I'm not supposed to be doing. And there's something inherently funny about the fact that everybody knows it and I'm in on the joke. And I always have like one or two jokes that I end up using a lot during a season. It's almost like an improv routine. You try out different material every night, and some things work and some things don't, and some things you keep and other things you lose. But I remember one year I would get on stage, and I think I actually said this when I was at the dinner with you. I got on stage and I said something like, "Good evening, everyone. My name is Lydia Fenet. I'm the auctioneer. I am so delighted to be here. And I can tell just by looking at your faces that none of you feel the same way." And everybody starts laughing because, of course, everybody hates the charity auction. And so then I'll say something like, "But I'm going to make it fast and furious and we're going to have a great time." And I think as long as I go into it, like, listen, I'm in on the joke, guys. I get it. This is not everyone's favorite part of the evening, but what if we have fun while we get through it? And like that, for some reason, gets the audience behind me. They understand that I'm on their side. I'm not going to stay on stage longer than I should, but I'm there to do a job and I want to do it well and I want to make it fun for everyone.
I'm glad you shared that, and I do remember that. And I'm
But
actually glad that you're bringing up. We kind of talked about earlier in your career, and we talked about when I met you, and I met you since you have broken on your own. So you were at Christie's for close to 25 years, or about 25 years, and you
yeah,
decided to launch your own agency. So what made you decide? After being with an organization, because a lot of people, if they're there 25 years, they're there 50. So
yeah.
what made you decide after 25 years or so, I'm going to launch the Lydia Fenet agency?
I'd always seen a huge white space in the charity auction space. And there were a number of conversations and things that I'd heard over the years that really made me feel like this was the direction that I was moving in. I was at the Goldman Sachs conference. I'm a keynote speaker, and I was speaking at the conference, and I was sitting in on some of the other sessions. And a woman named Candace Nelson, who founded Sprinkles Cupcakes and is
Know
on,
her, yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
she's so great. Candace was speaking, and someone said when they were on stage, two questions for you. What do you look for in a founder? Um, and then they asked something else. And she said, there are actually two answers to that first question. Whenever I'm looking for a founder to invest in, I always say to myself, does that founder have a deep knowledge of the industry? And I'm sitting there with 20 plus years of charity auctioneering under my belt thinking, wow, like, yeah, I definitely have a deep knowledge of the industry. I'd challenge most people to, I don't know that there are very few penny, I don't know that there are very few, wait, sorry. I don't know that there are many people who have more experience. And then she said, and the second thing I look for is someone who loves to sell. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I'm a founder. This is what I need to be doing. And the agency idea had come up. My best friend still swears she's told me to do it 15 times and I just didn't hear her, which might be true. But I think having worked for Christie's for so long, I realized at some point that my biggest fear was that I worked at Christie's and that was the only person I was, and that people only hired me to be an auctioneer because I worked at Christie's or only wanted my expertise because I worked at Christie's. And I think I'd really seen in the last 5 years of my role there that that wasn't true. Like people didn't even reach out using my Christie's email. It was usually either on social media or through my website. And I realized that even as I started sort of floating this out there, I might be leaving Christie's, so I'll pass you along. And they're like, no, where are you going? Are you going to another auction house? And I said, no, I'm going to start my own thing. And they were like, well, we'll just come with you. And I think when you start to hear that, you realize that at some point, even as much as you love the company you've been with, it doesn't always have to be your identity. And once I realized that I could drop it, I realized that the sky was the limit. And in many cases, it's better for me not to be associated with an auction house. When I was down taking the auction where we met, Sotheby's had sent an auctioneer to take the art auction portion of it, and I was taking the charity auction part. I couldn't have done that if Christie's was involved. So I realized that I was able to broaden my audience and I could also move in any direction I wanted. And that felt really exciting and really freeing. And then the other part was that for many, many years, people have been asking me to refer auctioneers. And I had never really seen a lot of the auctioneers except for the ones that I trained at Christie's on stage. And I guess it was probably like 2 months before I launched the agency, I was at an auction. It's the only gala that I go to in New York where I don't take the auction because every time I tell people I'm coming to a gala, even if they don't have an auction, they're like, but you could just get on stage with a microphone. So I really try to not go to any galas except if I'm on stage. And in this instance, I sort of said to the organizers, like, I would just love to have a night off. Like, I know everyone here. Let's just get someone else up there. And so there was a person who I had referred probably 50 auctions to over the years. And I sat at the table, like stunned by how many things he did wrong. And I was also, in a way, I felt embarrassed by the fact that I'd given my name without ever seeing his work. Because at the end of the day, we're only as good as our name, right? And so just basic mistakes. He was not an auctioneer. He was a fundraiser, and it all became so evident in that hour. The auction started during the appetizer. It was still going on after dessert, and it was 5 lots and a paddle raise, which is a 20 to 25-minute auction. Stop, full stop. And it was just one thing after another. And my husband turned to me, he's like, well, my God, no wonder you have so much business if this is somebody else who's working out there. And meanwhile, I'm thinking to myself, how many people I've given his name to. And I, at that moment, realized I needed to take ownership of what I've created in my own career and pass along the people who are correct for that job, who will do what the charities need them to do, and to train the people who I think have the potential to be really strong charity auctioneers. And so that sort of like fortuitous thing, Candace is speaking, seeing, so just being at the end of my career at Christie's, which was such a wonderful place. I loved every year of it, but was time. And so now it was just like I flipped the switch in my mind, and I was still an ambassador for Christie's at that point. And I basically just emailed them and said, like, it's been an honor and a privilege. And then I started my agency the next day.
Wow. So I mean, you like any good, like any great founder, you hit the ground running selling, the next day. So, talk a little bit about, what is one thing that all successful auctioneers have in common? Like, what's one thing you look for when you're adding someone to your roster and your staple of auctioneers?
I mean, they have to love to sell. They have to love, I mean, they're the person who's at Starbucks and is upselling you on the card, even though they don't work there. They're the person who, if you find them in the dressing room is trying to sell you something because, let's be honest, they like it, not because they work there. And I think that there are some people who just really love to sell, and that's a charity auctioneer. I mean, you have to get on that stage and tell every single person in there that they want that 7-bedroom house to Mexico, and you are coming up with 9 different angles for the reason they might want it. So I think that's number one. Number two, they have to be fearless on stage. I'm not looking to train people up from zero. That's not what I'm doing in my agency. I have an amazing woman who's an improv comedian who she was an MC one night, and she was doing this she was trying to get the crowd's attention. She just couldn't quite do it. And I was like, oh, I can give her 2 things that will absolutely help them listen to her, and she will kill it on stage. And she came running up to me afterwards and she was like, how did you do that? And I said to her, have you ever thought about being a charity auctioneer? She's like, not until literally right now, not until you just said that out loud. And now that's all I want. So I have a couple of people like that. I have a lot of auctioneers that I trained in the past who've gone on to other auction houses. And then I have a couple others who've just kind of drifted in my path. A woman who was a news anchor for 20 years in Charlotte, who's recently left that career. So there are people who are used to being in situations where they have to be good on their feet. They have to be able to pivot in and out of conversations very quickly. And most importantly, they have to be very comfortable with chaos because that's what it takes to be a charity auctioneer. Like nothing's going to go right. That's to be expected. If it does, you've never seen a charity auctioneer like that. So don't even pretend that that will. But it's never about you getting unnerved or rattled. It's about you dealing with everything that happens with a smile on your face.
That's all absolutely true. And it is, I always like to say a great auction is, I wouldn't say chaos, it's organized chaos. So it's kind of like this, for lack of a better term, symphony
Mm,
of individuals. And I always like sitting kind of in the back corner of the room sometimes because you kind of get to see all the parts of the symphony kind of going on
yeah.
within an auction. It's just, to me, it's a really fascinating thing to kind of watch and see all those pieces that you were talking about come in together. And you talked a little bit earlier about kind of what an art auction is, where people just kind of sit down, versus kind of a charity auction. Just because you have so much experience in the nonprofit auction space, talk about how it's different to auction off experiences, which versus auctioning off art items, because they're very different things and they're very different audiences. And talk about the differences between those two things.
Yeah, absolutely. Commercial auctioneering, which is what you would call art auctioneering or jewelry or cars versus charity auctioneering is it's a different skill set. I mean, the performative element is always there, but as I said at the beginning, if you really think about going to an art auction or, I'm flying to Amelia Island to take a car auction, you're walking into a room, you have a catalog of goods, you probably have a price that you're willing to stop or maybe pay a little more than, but in your mind, you kind of have an idea of what you're going in for and what you want to spend. And so as a result of that, as the auctioneer, a lot of what you're doing is handling the back end part of that. So let's say you, Rob, and I'm going to use cars because that's what I'm selling this weekend, but let's say that you have a car that's been in your family for 25 years and you decided to sell it. So the auctioneer would know that there is a price that you are willing to sell it at. Nobody else knows that price. It's that you, Rob, don't want it to go for under $100,000. So we might put an estimate on it. It's usually above the reserve. So maybe we put the estimate somewhere between $120,000 and $140,000 for this car. And I know that all I need to do as the auctioneer is get someone in the room to bid $100,000 and you will let that car go. Period. End of sentence. So what I'm doing as the auctioneer is I'm trying to drive up the bidding because I'm allowed to bid on your behalf up to $100,000. So I'm looking around the room trying to drive up that bidding, whether it be through my phone bidders, whether it be through my seated bidders, whether it be through a chandelier bid, which is a bid where you're just pretending that there's someone there because again, I'm bidding on your behalf basically up until the reserve. And my job is to not have anyone know what else is going on except to know that the bidding is going up. And so it's a lot of that. It's a lot of the sort of mathematical skill of making sure that I'm going to hit the reserve at the right time and that it's not going to end up with me or with the wrong person. In the car world too, the reserves can shift even in this last seconds before the bid's going. So I have like signs with the people who are on the phone bank, so I know when to stop and when to go. It's very complicated and it's very nuanced. In charity auctioneering, you have none of those things. You have an item and you have to figure as the auctioneer out, you have to figure out as the auctioneer how to sell it. So if you give me a list of 5 things and somebody says to me, like, I have an amazing ski house in Aspen that I would like to put on the market. What I would immediately think of the auctioneer, the first question I would ask is it only during ski season or could we use it year round? Because if I go out to a crowd of 500 people and say, I have an amazing ski house in Aspen, chances are a lot of those people don't ski. Second chance, a lot of them have been injured skiing or they're too old to ski at this point. And third option, maybe a lot of them don't even like winter. Or they don't like high altitude. So immediately there, I'm cutting off 75% of my audience and they'll just start talking because they're not going to bid on that. But if I can say like leaf peeping in the fall, amazing opportunities for hiking in the summer, spring flowers, winter skiing, all of a sudden everyone has an opportunity. So what I'm always trying to do as the auctioneer is broaden the sales pitch so that everyone in the room has an opportunity to think like, oh, I wasn't going to do a ski house in Aspen, but now that you've mentioned, I do love hiking and what an amazing opportunity. And then present them with mother-in-law gift, parents party. Like you just go on and on with all the options so that people can see it. And that's really like you don't do that. And I'm not sitting up there like trying to flog a car or flog a Picasso. You're never up there trying to like sell the actual work. You're selling the piece. Whereas in the charity auction world, you are unpacking it, you are trying every different way to do it. And that to me is the fundamental difference between the two. And so people a lot of times will ask me, like, if you're a good art auctioneer, does that make you a good charity auctioneer and vice versa? And I think the answer is a hard no. I think a lot of people who are very talented art auctioneers, and would tell you this, they really hate charity auctioneering. They like the numbers, they like standing behind the rostrum. It feels very organized, it feels very controlled. And so when you put that same person on a charity auction stage with a microphone, one piece of paper, and a mandate to make $5 million, that feels unwieldy and not fun. I sometimes say for me, I don't like being put back in the box. I much prefer charity auctioneering to anything because I like the chaos and I don't like the organized numbers and having to sort of stay on increment and not being able to joke with people in the room, which is very much my style. So it's interesting. You can do it. There's no question, but I do often think that people have a preference for one over the other.
Well, it's interesting, when you say that, and I love how you kind of how you explained everything so thoroughly. And it's just interesting because when I thought about, there was just something you said in the middle of it, and it clicked with me that a lot of the art auctions are much more about ego is more driving it. Whereas with a charity or a nonprofit auction, it is emotion is much more based there. And I think that that's why for some folks who may like art auctions, that's a much more corporate, it's numbersy, but you're not necessarily playing into the emotion. They're playing into it thinking about it as an investment. Whereas, yes, someone may buy a nice piece of art at an art auction at like an art gala like 2x2 for Amfar in Dallas,
Yeah.
but when the cause gets tied into it, their emotions come into play because they can remember happy feelings they had at the
Mhm.
Dallas Museum of Art, or how Amfar Research saved a friend of theirs life, or whatever that is. So it's just there was just something in the way that you said that it was like, oh, that those are the two silos. It's ego and it's emotion,
Yeah. And I think
and
like the other thing too is as the auctioneer, you get the opportunity to bring that out at the right time. I always say when I train people to be auctioneers, it's not about you hitting people over the head with the charity or whatever their mission is. It's about finding that perfect time to remind people of why they're there. So a lot of times as I get into those last, we're at $25,000 on my left, but 30 feels like the right thing. And I think we could get there. And I'm watching the people talk about whether or not they're going to bid that last bid. I'll say something like, and the most amazing thing is when you're on that beach in Mexico, when you're enjoying the warm water and the margaritas, you'll know that all the money that you've raised is going to help kids, and there's your $5,000, right? Like it's so funny. It's like you can't stand there as the person who's just like hitting everybody over the head with the mission, but dropped in at the perfect time, it moves the needle 9 times out of 10.
yeah, absolutely. And, I want to talk, I kind of want to delve a little bit more into the nonprofit piece here for a second because, you know, I think people listening today will be like, well, how does someone from New York get seated next to someone who lives in Austin and they become collaborators, and Lydia winds up being a guest on the podcast. So talk a little bit about the importance of establishing good relationships with nonprofit organizations. Because I know some things you have to kind of look at the local community, but what are some like universal things that you can recommend to people to establish those good relationships where it doesn't really matter geographically where you are?
I always feel like if people are moved by a mission, there is no border, really. And that to me is always the beauty of a nonprofit. And frankly, the reason I love my job so much. I don't care if I'm raising money. Last night I was on stage in New York raising money for a pediatric facility at the New York Presbyterian Hospital. Tomorrow I might be on stage in Portland raising money for healthcare for migrant workers who are working in the farms out there. To me, it's always about other people being helped by the work in the room that night and reminding people of the fact that every single person who is in that room can give something to someone else. And that's really what a nonprofit is about, right? It's all about helping other people. And to anyone who's interested in getting in a nonprofit, as I said, it doesn't matter where you do it. It's that you give to something or you give your time to something. And those things are equally important because not everybody can give money. Time, volunteering, those things are incredibly important to making the nonprofits move and actually work the way they're supposed to work. So I would say to people, find something you're passionate about. Whatever it is, whether it's you lost a friend to this, or this interests you, or you're moved to tears by the story of X, all of those things are wonderful. And all of those things give you the ability to get involved with someone and give in the truest form possible, which is really what nonprofit work is about.
Absolutely. And, I'd love for, to kind of delve a little bit further kind of into, the working with nonprofits with specific auction items, let's say. So if there's a specific auction item, what are some good ways that the nonprofit can work with the auctioneer as a partner so that they can give you either the table number that those people are at or what they may be wearing that night, how you can tie those specific items to major donors at a gala?
Yeah, I mean the pre-work, I would never overstate this. The pre-work before an auction is critical. People think that it's just magic in a room. No. There have been many meetings that should have taken place beforehand to make sure that the lots align with the people in the room. So what I would say is if you're a nonprofit right now and you're looking into your auction next spring or next fall, whenever you hear this, what you want to be thinking about is not necessarily the quantity of lots. In fact, in many cases, people are really turning away from the 10 to 12 lot auction. What you want to be thinking about is the quality of lots and if the quality matches. So all of your lots should be of such a good quality or such a priceless experience moment that people looking will think, wow, that's amazing. Every single one they see. Or, wow, that's something I could do. I just didn't think of it. And so that's really what you want to be thinking about with your live auction lots. And then the auctioneer's responsibility is to look at those lots with you and go through and be like, you know what? This is a great trip to Italy, but it's a hotel room. At the end of the day, it's 4 nights in a hotel. So let's beef this up. Let's think, do any of your board members have miles that they might be willing to donate or relationships with airlines? Are there fabulous Italian restaurants in town that could get people ready for the trip? Does anyone know of any Italian fashion house that could provide a bag or a beach towel or whatever it is to really beef up the lot? Because a lot in a live auction should be something that someone can't get by themselves. So yes, incredible to be able to get a hotel room. People could literally get online at that moment and see the retail value. What you're looking for is that priceless experience. Like, is there a language-based learning app that would donate a couple of hours? Or maybe there's someone in person who could come to your house and teach you Italian just to get around town. Just anything to spark people's creativity and make them think like, oh, that's cool and fun. And then the other thing I would say is that with live auction lots, the other way you can really make a lot of money is to think about people in the organizations that you have that are beloved. So I'll give you an example. I took an auction for the Central Park Conservancy for one of their big anniversaries years ago, and they had a gardener named Tom who people absolutely loved. And so we offered the ability to have lunch with Tom. You'd bring 9 friends, he would take you to all his favorite places in the park, explain to you what he does on an average Tuesday, and you get to have lunch with Tom. We sold it for $50,000 and we sold it 3 times. I started the bidding at $1,000. People just loved him and they wanted to give money. And because at that point it seemed altruistic and it wasn't motivated by, I need a house in Deer Valley, it felt authentic to the cause and people were having a blast. And so I remember saying at the end, I was like, and by the way, lunch is not included. So Tom was in the back. He's like, I'll make sandwiches. I was like, and Tom will make sandwiches. I was like, do you take requests? He's like, I don't really know how to make that many sandwiches. I was like, so you just eat whatever Tom brings as part of the lunch. But that wasn't why people were doing it. I suspect half of them didn't even redeem it. It was just a way to do something great for the nonprofit that felt good for everyone in the room. And people were going wild. I remember I sold it at 50 and someone's like, would he double it? And Tom's like, I'll go as many times as you want. And then 2 more hands went up and all of a sudden it's $150,000 for something we thought would go for maybe like, 4 or 5 thousand. So, just think about your live lots being creative and fun, tied to the organization whenever possible. And if not, really wow lots.
That I love that explanation. And what's great about hearing that is is that, I always say great events have three types of capital. They have financial capital, they have social capital, but they have human capital. And the fact that you were able to tie human capital into the financial capital to drive up the bidding, you really got to see the value of everybody, the people that are beloved that work at the organization, all the way to the major donors who are able to, provide $50,000 to help preserve the park. I mean, that's really an incredible story.
Yeah, it really, and it's fun. It's fun when they go like that. It's fun to watch them fly.
Absolutely. And, one other thing I do want to talk about while I have you is, you've worked alongside many celebrities in your time. Matt Damon, Hugh Jackman, Elton John, Jerry Seinfeld. I think even Oprah introduced you one time.
Yeah.
If I recall, I do have to ask because I'm an Oprah fan. Did she say your name in that Oprah way
Yeah.
first?
He actually does sound like Oprah. It's amazing. It's really very cool. It's very cool.
That's awesome. I am glad to hear that. I'm glad I met a person who Oprah has said their name in her special way. So that is another wonderful thing to like about Lydia. So, but in all seriousness, what is the key to working successfully with celebrities who are raising funds on behalf of an organization? Because it's quite an impressive list of folks that you've worked with over the years.
I think that you just always have to remember that they're people. People get so wrapped up in celebrity. And what I've realized being on stage with so many people over the course of my career, I mean, half the time they don't want to be the fundraiser. They'll say to me, like, I don't really want to do this. Can you just sort of take this away? So being upfront about what someone's role and responsibility is with a celebrity is a huge thing. If you have an auctioneer, let them be the auctioneer. And if the celebrity wants to come on stage and say a couple of words, that's great. As I said earlier, one of the most important things is the ability to be flexible. If a celebrity is a TV or film star, they may not be that comfortable on stage. So putting them up there doesn't really help anyone because either they just kind of stand idly or they kind of point out numbers at the same time as you. So you end up tripping over each other's words. Best case scenario, you have someone like Seth Meyers, who's super fun and really easy to sort of interplay with or things like that. But for most celebrities, I would say either have them introduce the lot, have them introduce something and that be their job. Lot number one is this amazing watch. They can kind of riff on that and then leave the auctioneering to the auctioneer.
That's a really great tidbit and piece of advice. And and I'm glad that you brought up not just because someone, and it's so funny because when people see them on a screen, they become their friend. And
Yeah.
and when you're on a stage, those people are playing a part. So they may be inherently shy. They may be brilliant at their craft, but it's also what they do for a living. Like, you're an auctioneer for a living. So, you just got to kind of keep those things in mind. So I really appreciate you, look at the celebrity holistically as a person and what they bring and what they're comfortable with and what their strengths are, and lean into that just like you would with any other person that that you would work with. I think that's a great piece of advice. Now, I know we're running short on time, but I do want to ask one final question, and that is, after raising $1 billion, what is one thing? It's actually a twofold question. What is one thing you've learned, just from that experience that you will always take with you, whether you're an auctioneer or not? And secondly, what is one thing that all successful auctions have in common?
The first thing I would say that I've learned is that people are always happy to help and give if inspired in the right way. So it doesn't matter if it is a captain of industry, a celebrity, or a random person that you're seated next to, they want to feel part of something bigger. And in any nonprofit auction, in my opinion, the most important thing is to make everybody feel special and included, and never to make people feel like they can't give and therefore they're not there for the right reason. And so I always drill that into auctioneers because it's not about the guy who's giving 50,000, because that 50,000 to him might feel the same as $50 to someone else. So celebrate everyone equally. Giving time, giving money, whatever it is, always important. What was the second question?
Oh, and then just what's one thing all successful auctions have in common?
One thing all successful auctions have in common is a fabulous auctioneer on stage.
And the most fabulous of them all, everybody, is Lydia Fenet, and that really is true. And like I just remember you when we first met at the Contemporary Art Dinner, you would talk about I make sure these auctions last X number of minutes. And there was one auction you did, you told me lasted 7 minutes. So it's, that adds fun because there is, with auctioneers, as with anything at a nonprofit event, there's a law of diminishing returns.
Mhm.
And you really understand that, I think, better than any other auctioneer I've talked to. So, I'm really proud that I get to call you a friend. I'm proud that I got to sit next to you. And I'm just so excited to see you be so successful in this new endeavor and taking the leap and really shining and soaring. So thank you again for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Rob. I'm so delighted to be on here. And I feel like we've just had a conversation at dinner again. It was so fun.
Dinner 2.0, everybody.
Exactly. Exactly.
So for more information about Lydia Fenet and the Lydia Fenet Agency, please visit lydiafenet, Fenet.com. And that will do it for this episode of Fun and Fundraising. I'm your host, Rob Giardinelli, reminding you to keep it fun, keep it interesting, and your guests will have a great time. Have a great day, everyone, and take care.